Hello ladies and gentlemen, Koldar here, and we are looking at Heroic Blade Lord Tayok in Heart of Fear. So, first things first, this dude is a pretty easy heroic fight. I would highly recommend those groups looking for new heroic content to try out. Take a look at this guy if you have not. I think he's much easier than most of the heroics that we've seen in this entire tier so far, and probably around the same difficulty as Stone Guard, maybe even easier. Certainly took us a lot fewer attempts to get this guy down than any other heroic boss. I think it was a dozen tries for this guy. So yeah, I would say give it a shot. He's pretty simple. Anyway, for the video, let's I'll talk a little bit about the differences between heroic and normal. Mostly changes to existing abilities, although there is one new ability, and how that will all affect your overall strategy and pretty much the things you have to focus on tactically to get through this fight as clean as possible. And then we'll just kind of do a short walkthrough probably, and that's about it. So let's get started. Now, just like on normal, you'll deal with the same basic abilities on heroic with the addition of one new ability from the boss, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But unfortunately, because of the way the encounter is set up, where you just fight the boss in this one basic phase most of the fight and deal with his abilities as they come up off cooldown, there's really no good way to walk through or explain this fight without talking about each ability in turn and sort of explaining how it works on heroic. So normally I don't like to do videos like that, and I apologize, but I will try to offer some insight and detailed information about each of these abilities and sort of explain how it is they'll change the fight on heroic and what you can do to manage that. So anyway, to get started, we'll talk about Tempest Slash, which is the attack he'll target on a random range member and spawn a tornado at their location. So if you've not seen the normal guide version for this encounter, I would suggest checking that out. It explains in detail how we handle Tempest Slash, but the basic idea is that we form a half circle or half moon shape using our ranged and healers toward the back of the hall. So this is toward the side of the hall that we are coming from. And by doing so, any tornado that targets a random ranged player is automatically not going to be toward the front of the hall, which is where we're going toward at any given moment. So once there are too many tornadoes in that position, then we just step forward a few yards into some open free space and wait for more tornadoes and repeat the process. So this has worked quite well, and it keeps the path clear most of the time. So other than that, obviously you just want to not get hit by the tornado, so you want to keep enough distance that random knockback is not going to hit you into tornadoes and kill you if you can help it. So just be careful of that. Now, you will need 2 tanks, just like on normal. And again, this is because of Overwhelming Assault, which of course is a debuff used on your tanks. And it's a huge melee hit, but then it also applies the 45-second Overwhelming Assault debuff, which increases damage taken from Overwhelming Assault hits by 100% for 45 seconds. So, the good news is that on heroic, because of the addition of one of the new special abilities, which I'll talk about in a second, the timing of Overwhelming Assaults will always allow your tanks to trade off the boss after they've been afflicted with one Overwhelming Assault hit. So, basically your first tank will take Overwhelming Assault, your second tank will taunt, they'll take the second Overwhelming Assault, and then by the time the third Overwhelming Assault hits, the first tank will have their debuff dropped off by then because of the special ability. So you get a nice delay, and therefore no tank should ever take an Overwhelming Assault while they have the debuff active on them. Now you still want to use a cooldown on your tanks when it's about to hit. Obviously it's not exact, but it's approximate. So just try to get a feel on that. But never take an extra one if you have the debuff already. That's the basic rule. Otherwise, you're going to get smacked really hard. But it's pretty simple otherwise. So that's really all there is to the tanking in this. Now, Unseen Strike on Heroic is used every 1 minute like clockwork. And just like in normal, it targets a random player and marks them with a red arrow. And then everyone in the raid that is capable should stack on that player within about 5 seconds before the hit occurs. On Heroic, this does a huge amount of damage, about 4.5 million physical, split among all raid members that it hits. So even with 10 players getting hit, it's still 450,000 physical, which obviously is a huge amount. Now it is reduced by armor values, so armor mitigation and damage reductions. But that said, if you have low armor, you're going to get clobbered. And it's really, really important that everyone in the raid is full health when this is going on. So your healers need to be really adamant about topping people up. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the final couple abilities. But even at 450,000 before mitigation, your low armor classes are going to want to try to use cooldowns. My best suggestion is to use personal damage reduction cooldowns every time Unseen Strike hits, if you can. So even if that means changing your talents and losing, some sort of utility or DPS or something that you might want elsewhere, it's probably going to be worth it, because if everyone can do even a minor reduction on that hit, it's going to be massively useful. So, yeah, and then worst case scenario, of course, is that if someone is not positioned quite right and they don't get hit, now 9 players are taking that for 4.5 million, and that's even more extra damage. So, again, short cooldowns, small cooldowns, anything you can really will be very helpful on that one. The new ability for Heroic is Blade Tempest, and this is a pretty cool ability. But I consider it his other special attack next to Unseen Strike, because both of these have a 1 minute cooldown and they alternate in casts. And this alternation is very important when we talk about how you handle the final ability, which we'll get to in a second. But essentially what you can count on is that every 30 seconds he will do the next of these special abilities, whichever one he didn't do last time. And so you'll kind of get used to the pattern very quickly. So, in this case, Blade Tempest is basically a 3-second cast, at which point, right at the beginning of that cast, he will suck everyone into his current position, right in the center of his model. And then you have 3 seconds as he's casting to run away from him immediately as far as you can get, because once he finishes that 3-second cast, he will start to channel the Blade Tempest. So here he's doing the 3-second cast, and now he's channeling Blade Tempest for 6 seconds. And if you look on the left, there's sort of some wind around him. It was kind of hard to see. You'll see it a little bit later more clearly. But basically, if you are within that windy area, right within melee range of him while he's channeling the 6-second channel, you'll take 300,000 physical damage every half second. So it just destroys you really quickly. And while he's channeling, he's sucking everyone toward him. So you've probably seen these mechanics in other situations, often where you're running against the wind, but it's sort of the same thing in the last phase. On the sides, you have these streams of wind that you can go against or ride in, and that's similar to how it works. In this case, you're pulling against it. You want to get away from him, and he's trying to suck you in. So that said, it's pretty easy to avoid it if you just react quickly. So you can see there, we get pulled in and start running away. Now you'll notice that I'm running away from him even though my camera is facing toward him. Some people reported issues with camera facing and movement. And I think the main thing is that if you change the direction that you start to move because you get confused about your camera facing, then you might have trouble. What I found, and it worked great for me every time, was once we were sucked in, I just started moving in one direction, didn't really matter where. And if I'm holding that direction down, it doesn't matter where I look with my camera, I'll just continue to go in that same basic direction that I started in. So I think that's the key there, is not to actually try to change the direction or confuse yourself about your camera facing. Just simply keep moving in the direction you were going. additional thing you can do is to use movement increasing effects. So this will give you a little bit of breathing room. So like our druid would use her roar, and there it is there, and everyone get this huge boost of speed, and you can see with a lot of speed you can actually outrun the pull in. Otherwise you're pretty much going the same speed as it with normal movement plus enchant on your boots. So yeah, any little bit you can do to help you move a little faster will make things a little less stressful for that. But that said, no one should ever get hit by the actual attack because you're all running out right away, and therefore you shouldn't ever take damage from that ability. It should be quite simple, and that's one of the reasons that the heroic version of this is not that bad, is because the new ability is very easy to avoid. So let's move on to the final ability that we'll talk about. Last but not least, we have Wind Step. And I saved this ability for last, even though it exists on normal, because in my opinion, on heroic, properly managing Wind Step is the key factor to successfully doing this fight on heroic. I don't know about you, but on normal, I didn't really even think about this ability. It's just minor dot damage, pretty irrelevant, doesn't really matter. But in my opinion, on heroic, properly handling this ability will make or break this encounter for you. The good news is that if you plan ahead a little bit and sort of think about how it is that your particular raid makeup can handle this ability before you actually start attempts, once you get into trying the boss, everything else will fall into place very quickly. This is really the only thing that you have to think about in detail and sort of plan around. So, the reason that Wind Step is so difficult in heroic is pretty much just because of the damage it deals. So it's a 30-second cooldown ability. Every 30 seconds he'll use it on a random ranged player. So it prefers people at range. And it's got an AE effect to it as well, so it will hit anyone within about 10 yards of that player's location. So it's important, because it's every 30 seconds, that you pretty much maintain a spread of your ranged players throughout the entire, first phase, most of the fight. When it hits, it debuffs that player for 30 seconds as well, and it will deal 150,000 damage to them every 2 seconds. So, obviously that's 75,000 damage per second to that player, and that's a huge amount of damage that needs to be mitigated throughout the entire first 80% of this fight, pretty much, because it's going to be lasting for 30 seconds, and it's going to be recast every 30 seconds. So it should always have one active, pretty much. Now, this damage is not any particular damage type. So it's not just like physical damage that you can reduce from armor. The only reductions that affect it are actual baseline damage reductions. So innate damage reductions from your class or cooldown abilities will lower the damage. But other than that, you just have to heal through the damage pretty much. So doing this is really, like I said, the key factor in this. And the reason it's so deadly is that it will alone probably take the focus of one healer almost entirely while it's active, just to deal with that damage. But the real problem is that it combines with other abilities, namely with Unseen Strike. So obviously, I talked about before, Unseen Strike is doing 450,000 physical to each individual player before armor reductions and all that stuff. But if you add on a tick of 150,000 every 2 seconds, that tick from the Wind Step debuff on a player occurring around the moment that Unseen Strike hits is going to be a massive dump of damage. And they have to survive that somehow, right? So this is really the trick to this fight, is figuring out a way for those players with the Wind Step debuff to survive Unseen Strike hits. And of course, the good news is there are many ways you can do it. I'll talk about what we found worked best, and you can kind of draw some conclusions about how your raid might be able to do as well. Now, to properly handle Wind Step, the first thing to do is to think about the 30-second cooldown of Wind Step in relation to the 60-second cooldowns of each of the special abilities. And because the special abilities alternate, you basically have one special occurring every 30 seconds, whereas Wind Step also occurs every 30 seconds, and the debuff lasts for 30 seconds. So you will always have a Wind Step active during a special ability. Now, I mentioned before that the Blade Tempest special ability is not actually that dangerous. It's quite easy to avoid all the damage from this. So, for the most part, the Wind Step that is active during that ability is not going to be a danger to a player that starts full health. Now, they will take a lot of damage still, and some healers do have trouble healing while they're moving, which they'll need to be doing. But for the most part, you should be able to keep someone alive fairly easily if they have the dot on them during the Blade Tempest, draw away phase. So, one thing you can do to really help with that particular phase is to have one of your paladins, if you have a paladin, get the talent called, Hand of Purity. And this will allow them to put a 6-second buff on that player that reduces damage over time effects by 70% for those 6 seconds. And the good news is it only has a 30-second cooldown. So this person can use this at some point every time Wind Step is on a player. And this is ideal for the 6-second channel duration of Blade Tempest. So our Paladin healer used it on every Blade Tempest Wind Step target every time. And it's a huge amount of damage reduction, obviously. So that should pretty much always save that person from being in any danger during that phase. That said, as I mentioned before, the danger here is Unseen Strike. So in addition to 450,000 physical damage that everyone will take on their own, if that player also has Wind Step, the tick damage is going to add up quite a bit with another one and be very scary. So I think you should really focus solely on figuring out how to manage Wind Steps that occur during the Unseen Strike specials only. So every 60 seconds, have some way to mitigate that Wind Step or the Unseen Strike damage on the player that has Wind Step, either way. Now, how to do that is obviously based a lot on your raid makeup. But the good news is that Wind Step is a physical debuff. And because of that, you can use like Hand of Protection from Paladins to get rid of it entirely. It will just remove the debuff. You can also use immunity effects, so Ice Block or Divine Shield, that kind of thing. We'll get rid of it as well. But the key here is not to use these effects that get rid of Wind Step before the incorrect special attack occurs. So the basic pattern is that since the specials alternate, you'll start with a Wind Step, and then 15 seconds later you'll get your first special, which will be the Unseen Strike. And then you'll get another Wind Step 15 seconds later, and then your first Blade Tempest, and then Wind Step again, then Unseen Strike, then Wind Step, then Blade Tempest, and so on. So every Wind Step that occurs before Unseen Strike is due, you should try to mitigate that one. If you can get rid of it with immunity or Hand of Protection, that's great. If you can't, then you have to plan to have a cooldown available for that player during the Unseen Strike so that they do not die from strike plus Wind Step damage. But then the next Wind Step that's occurring before Blade Tempest, again, is not very dangerous. You can let that one run its full course. So essentially what we try to do is you're going to get about 10 total Wind Steps during the first phase, most of the fight, before you just eventually hit the Berserk or you have to push them over into the next phase. And 5 of those, since only every other one is before Unseen Strike, 5 of those should try to be mitigated in some way. So we use 2 Hand of Protections on the first 2. If it lands on one of our immunity capable classes like Paladin or Mage, they get rid of it on their own before we use Hand of Protection. And, all these little things add up so that for the most part, you rarely have to actually use a direct cooldown on someone during Unseen Strike with Windstep. If you do, then you can use your backup cooldowns. So like my a targetable cooldown that provides an absorb shield is good for that purpose, as a monk healer. So anyway, the idea, as I said, is just to think about if you can get rid of the debuff that is occurring just before the Unseen Strike that's coming up. If you can do that, get rid of it right away, and that will save you all the healing that you'd have to do otherwise. If you can't get rid of it, then plan ahead for a cooldown during the Unseen Strike on that player. And then you can just heal through or mitigate the damage that occurs for Windstep on the following one, and just heal through that 30-second duration. So, like I said, that's really just the key thing to cover in this fight. And once you get that down, then the rest will fall into place. So just like in normal, at 20% health, Blade Lord will suck everyone to the center and begin the final Storm Unleashed phase. And you just have to go through the gauntlet or tornadoes to get to him, get him to 10%, and then he'll swap sides, and you have to do it again and finish him off. So mechanically, it works exactly the same as normal. Everything's just ramped up a bit. So just like in normal, he will gain Intensify, which increases his damage and haste by 5% per stack. And during the first part of the fight, he'll gain 1 stack every 1 minute. Fairly slow rate. But during this final phase, he gains 1 stack of Intensify every 10 seconds. So this is your soft and rage mechanic, basically, because as this phase progresses, damage from Storm Unleashed ticks will increase that much more. So Storm Unleashed on Heroic does pretty heavy damage. It's 20,000 damage per second to everyone in the raid. And then this is amplified by Intensify. So obviously at 20 stacks, it's 40,000 damage every second. It's a huge amount to heal through when you're running around like crazy. So the first thing I would suggest is that the initial drop-off point before you've actually reached the boss the first time is the best time to use any movement increasing effects because your entire raid will be moving as a group, and therefore these effects can hit everybody. The only thing you need to be careful about is that people that are really fast, that have extra movement, don't get too far ahead of the raid and therefore out of range of healing and cooldowns and stuff. You want to stay somewhat grouped up so that these AE effects or just the ranges are not an issue. Because if you get too far ahead or too far behind, obviously it's going to be bad times. But otherwise, you should use all your movement increasing effects at the start, just as you get dropped off. You can also pause for a moment at the drop-off point and purposely heal up the raid there to full. So if you take 10 extra seconds, say, to heal everyone up when you get dropped off, you'll get 1 more stack of Intensify during that time. It's a pretty minor amount of extra damage that you're adding on, but the benefit would be to ensure that everyone is full health when you start the run. We didn't really do that, and I think that was a mistake, but, that would be my suggestion. Likewise, when you're running back, which I'll talk about in a second here, the other direction, you can do the same thing. However, coming back after you get over there the first time and get them to 10%, the portion of going back can actually be mitigated a lot because of a trick that many people are using now. This is basically taking advantage of the strong gusts in the gutters on the side of the room. So when the boss gets to around 11 or 12% health, depending on your DPS, have all of your DPS, save for 1 DPS player, step into one of the gusts on the side of the room, and they can ride it all the way down to the other end of the platform right away and step out, and they'll be at the location that the boss will end up next. Meanwhile, your 1 DPS that remains and the healer that stays with them stay at the boss and finish him off that last 1 or 1.5% of his health, and then they have to actually manually run the gauntlet. So you can see here, we tried to keep myself and 2 DPS behind. This is only the second time we'd seen this phase, so you can see, like I said, this stuff is pretty easy, this fight, even though we screwed up majorly here. But 3 people was just unnecessary. You don't need that much damage to stay behind. And it's really hard to heal those people, at least I find as a monk, when the stacks are this high at this point in Intensify. So I would suggest just keeping 1 DPS and 1 healer behind, and then that healer just plan ahead to use maximum cooldowns and allow those, yourselves to get back. So, for example, I had my Absorb Shield, my Life Cocoon that I used on one of our DPS, and he was able to basically just ride that the entire way down before it wore off, and then he was in heal range of the other healer. But meanwhile, the Warlock and myself, we sacrificed ourselves for the good of mankind and just sat on our faces until the boss fell over. So, yeah, just be careful of that. But the key here, as I said, is to find the right timing so that the majority of your raid can step away from Blade Lord as he's 11 or 12%, ride that stream on the side down to the other end, and about the time that they're getting there, the boss will transition and appear right there. And this is just a free ride that they don't have to dodge any tornadoes, and therefore the healer that's down there can easily heal with AE healing and keep the raid alive. So that's pretty much it, I think. Heroic Blade Lord is, like I said, not that difficult to fight. I think if you just focus on the importance of the wind step debuff, assigning a healer to that specifically, figuring out your abilities that you have available to get rid of it entirely and using those on the ones before Unseen Strike, that's useful. You can use minor mitigation on wind steps that occur during Blade Tempest, during that special. Tank healing should not be an issue. Just have 1 healer assigned to tanks. The other one will be on wind step if you're using 2 healers. And the rest of the stuff is pretty much just the same. Keep everyone topped off when they're about to get Unseen Strikes, and you should survive that just fine. So you can watch as I look upon the boss from far away and dream of what it would be like to attack him. But that's it. That's Blade Lord Tayok on Heroic. So good luck, and thanks for watching.